Well, hey there, Doxology. It is great to see you. Thank you for worshiping with us today. And to those of you I can't see, we are grateful that you're worshiping with us online. Great to have you guys as well today. Whether you're joining us from there or you're joining us here, would you grab a Bible and meet me in 1 Thessalonians Chapter 1. 1 Thessalonians Chapter 1 is where we're going to be today as we continue, actually finish up this series that we've been in 1 Thessalonians 1 for the last 3 weeks called Strengthening Your Core. We've been looking at this church over the last 3 weeks that found itself planted in a pressurized, tension-filled world, and yet it found and revealed that it had strength that actually echoed, not just right there where they were, but echoed all around the world. And in fact, if you were to go to Acts chapter 17 sometime this week, and I hope you will, and look at how this church got started, you'll see that when this church was planted, even from its very first couple of days, it was planted in the middle of a society, in the middle of a culture where there was racial tension. You see it at the very beginning. Where there's political unrest. You see this church that was planted in the middle of a culture where there were violent protests and all kinds of cultural upheaval everywhere they were. And in fact, we know from history it was planted at a time in the middle of a huge political change of power. So Thessalonica was in a part of Greece that was ruled by the Romans, and yet at the time of the writing of this letter, when this church was planted, Rome's grip was starting to slip on this area of the world. So there were these huge fault lines all around the culture, and this church was trying to figure out how to live in the middle of a world like that during times like those. And yet, in just a few months that they've been following Jesus, word had begun to spread all around the world to the point that word of their spiritual strength had become known, quote, everywhere. And so we're asking ourselves the question, hypothetically, just in case we ever found ourselves living in the middle of cultural unrest and fault lines in our culture and political upheaval, racial tension, in a pressurized, tension-filled world, just in case, we might want to know where that kind of strength comes from and how it's revealed in a world like ours. And as we wrap up the series today, that's actually the point that we come to. We're asking ourselves the question at this point, how does real spiritual core strength show up in a world like ours? And I think about this a lot. I live in a world, and you live in a world, where most of the people that I do life around are pretty okay people. I mean, most of my neighbors are good neighbors. They're good people. They're moral people. And if you think through your life, probably the people that you live around, the people in your sorority or fraternity or in your dorm, your apartment complex, the people in your neighborhood, the people at your work, for the most part, they're good, nice, kind, helpful, with a few exceptions, good people. They may even be religious people. And yet you know that they don't know the Jesus that you know. They haven't connected with him. They're sure not seeing their life transformed to look more like him these days. They're good people. They're nice people, moral people. They're American, Judeo-Christian, ethic, good citizen people. On the surface, everything seems the same. When at the core, you know it may be fundamentally different. So how does core strength show up in a world like ours? Here's the big point that I think the Thessalonians are going to show us today. It's this: strength can't be seen on the surface. It can only be revealed under pressure. Isn't that true? I mean, I can see muscles on the surface, but the appearance of muscles is not always an indication of strength, is it? I mean, in fact, have you seen the video of the guy at the baseball game, muscled up guy trying to open up a bottle of water? If you haven't seen it, I think we have it for you. Check this out.
Another change up, and it's 2-1.
Oh, come on. Hey.
All that working out, and you can't open a water bottle?
Oh, come on. What's he? Sir, I think you got the wrong workout program.
I mean, muscles, clearly, I don't want to brag. You can't always see strength. I mean, look at me. But I could do this all day. We know when it's true spiritually, or when it's true physically. What about spiritually? It's not always shown on the surface. It's revealed under pressure. Only way to know that you've got physical strength is to put it under a circumstance, right? Strength can't be bought or sold. You're not born with it. You can't inherit it. It can only be developed and revealed. So when it comes to spiritual core strength, where and how is it developed? And where and how is it revealed? We wrap up the series looking at this group of people who had strength that was known, quote, everywhere. That's the question we want to ask. How and where was their strength developed? And where and how was it revealed in a world like ours, during times like these? That's what I want to invite us into today as we look at the last 4 verses of this chapter, but really focus on the last verse and a half. Here's what I think is so cool of the way that this chapter ends. Paul lets us in on 4 specific things that the world, not just in Thessalonica, notice, not just the 4 specific things that the Thessalonians hoped would be true of their spiritual strength, the 4 specific things that became known about their strength all throughout the world. The way that even the world beyond the Thessalonians reported back about how their strength was different and maybe even stronger than the people in the culture where they lived. Look at 1 Thessalonians Chapter 1, beginning in verse 7. Paul's writing and he says, "And so," this is where we left off last week, "you became a model to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia. The Lord's message rang out from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia. Your faith in God has become known everywhere." There it is. Therefore, we don't need to say anything about it, for they themselves, the people out there, report what kind of reception you gave us, what kind of impact our message and model had on your life and through your life. They tell us, what do they tell us, Paul? They tell us how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because we talk about this all the time. And the reason that we talk about it all the time is that it's literally inherent in our name, doxology. If you've been around doxology for long, you know doxology is the combination of 2 Greek words. One of them means the way that God shows up and shows off who he is and what he's like. And the other word is a word that talks about how God speaks up and says who he is and what he's like. And when you put those together, it gets who we're trying to be, who we believe we're called to be, a church who is showing and telling who God is and what he's like everywhere we're sent, from the neighborhoods to the nations. We talk about how both of those are important, showing and telling. If all you ever do is show and you never tell, that's not helpful. But isn't it right if all you ever do is tell and you never show? That's hypocritical. And we don't want to be either of those. We want to be people who are showing and telling who God is and what he's like everywhere we're sent, from our neighborhood to the nations. And you see that all throughout this passage, don't you? See the model and the message. He says, we didn't just come with words telling, but with power, showing. You were imitators of us, showing. We brought a message, telling. Over and over and over, showing and telling are a part of revealing the core spiritual strength that you have and are called to show and tell wherever you find yourself going. Look back at the second half of verse 9. In a tension-filled, pressurized society filled with moral and religious people, word got back to Paul that the Thessalonians revealed significant spiritual core, strong spiritual core in 4 specific ways. I want to show you what they are and ask you what it would look like for us to reveal something similar. Look back at the second half of verse 9. They tell how you, look at this, turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath. Now think about this. In a world like ours, during times like these were the 4 big ways these people stood out. Or you could think about it this way. When the story of their story was told, when the story of their spiritual strength was told, these were the stories that you saw and you heard. And I want us to talk through them, not just so we can see them, but so that we can be prepared to show them and tell them in our world as well. You ready for that? Okay, so look at the first one. There in verse 9, it says, the world everywhere reported that the Thessalonians responded to their connection with Christ as they transformed together by, he says, turning to God from idols to serve the living and true God. Okay, now I don't know what you think of when you think about idols. Don't just think about little gold statue or figurine on a shelf or something at a temple in a place far from home. I mean, it may include that, but it's not limited to that. In fact, it probably wasn't that for most of these people Paul was writing to. Remember, most of them grew up Jewish. They wouldn't have had any figurines or statues of any kind in their home or the physical items that we tend to think of when we think of idols. When the Bible talks about idols, the Bible's talking about anything or anyone that you pursue in order to get something God has promised. Anything or anyone you pursue to get something God has promised. You think about it in our world, that tends to reveal itself among three things. Things that we crave, pleasure or power or purpose, anything that we try to get from outside where God's promised it, things that we crave, things that we fear. We tend to turn things that we fear into gods, don't we? And we worship them or satisfy them or serve them in order to try to ward off the bad things that could happen. Things that we crave, things that we fear, things that we trust. People, philosophies, worldviews, or things that we believe can deliver us from all of those fears, whatever they are. So our idols, think about it, could be anything from our careers to our cars, from porn to possession to politics. Tim Keller says an idol is anything that is more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart or your imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give you. And the problem with idols is they never fail to fail. They're never satisfied with your worship, and they never satisfy you. They will require you to give your life to them, and they will never give life to you because they can't, because they're not living. They don't have life to give. See, here the Thessalonians had a reputation as people who said, I've stopped serving gods who require my life but will not give me life. And I'm serving the living and true God instead. And that got noticed in a world that was trying like crazy to find life that's truly life wherever it could grab it. How does core strength develop? It develops in environments where we realize we're looking for life in all the wrong places. We're slaves to things that will never give us freedom. Over and over, it develops as we provide resistance to the resistance in our heart and turn to the living and true God from there, where we find hope and freedom, courage, and when we do, the world takes notice of a life that's found life. It's revealed. So the first way this shows up for the Thessalonians, you could write it this way: strength is revealed through life transformation. Life transformation, a life with a capital L, life that's really life transformation. Are there moments in your story where your life has transformed from searching for life among dying things, philosophies, places, to finding your life in Him? Do people see you modeling that message in the middle of a world like ours? Could it intersect with a story like theirs? I used to think that climbing the corporate ladder of success would find me the significance that I was looking for. And then I got to the top of the ladder and realized it was leaning against the wrong building all along. That significance and success would only be found in the promises of God, the kind that I was after and longing for in my life. I used to worship at the idol of cable news and Google, thinking if I was just a little more informed, I'd be a lot less afraid. and have discovered I don't find freedom there or hope there, but I find it in the promises of Jesus instead. I used to trust in my investment portfolio, my retirement. It was my security for my future until 1987, until 2008, until 2020, when I realized I needed to find a better Savior. Today I'm still building it, but I'm no longer worshiping it. Showing and telling strength through showing and telling a life. It's being transformed by Jesus. Do a quick inventory of your life. Do you have quick access to stories like that in your story? That you could show or even tell when you find that your story intersects with the story of someone that God's placed near you? Life transformation is the first place that strength gets revealed in a world like ours. Look at the second one. The second one is this: strength is revealed through patience, through life transformation and through patience. You see it there in the first part of verse 10? It says, strength was developed and revealed in a place where the world could see your life transformation from idols to the living and true God. Look what it says, and to wait for his Son from heaven. So remember, these weren't people with power in their day. In fact, when you read the story of this church beginning in Acts chapter 17, how it started, they're in the middle of a misinformation campaign. They are falsely accused, they're hauled into court, they're hauled into prison, and then they're only released from prison after they post bail for a crime that they never committed. So when word gets back to Paul that they're waiting on Jesus from heaven, it's not the idea that the church is sitting on a park bench looking at their watch being inconvenienced because Jesus is running late. They're waiting for Jesus here is really directly tied to the fact that they know they live in a world that's not fair, where they're over and over experiencing the unfairness of the world. They're not getting a fair shake. The people in their world are not telling the truth. And in big ways and small ways, they keep finding themselves being treated unjustly. But rather than going to bitterness, rather than going to blows, they live with anticipation that pushes back against the circumstances with patience. And it develops their strength at every turn. When the world wasn't fair, they model this manner and proclaim this message that says Jesus is going to make things right by us, and he could do it at any second. They're not lashing back out. They're not trying to grab all the power back. They're not matching violence with violence or threats for threats. They're not conspiring to overthrow all of the power structures in the world that have held them down or held them back. They're living with a steady, settled patience on Jesus that says he's coming back. He's going to make things right by us. And the places that we've been misunderstood and misrepresented, mistreated along the way, they haven't gone unnoticed by him. He's seen every single one of them. And they won't go unaddressed by him. So I'm going to live a story, and I'm going to tell a story and show a story of strength in the world where I live because I believe that this story is true. Look, living like that is not normal. That kind of strength is strength that stands out even in a moral world like ours, and especially in an angry world full of people who love to flex their muscles, to power up or blow up every single time they get a chance. Strength's revealed through patience. The third thing is this, keep reading. Living in true God, to wait for his Son from heaven, verse 10, whom he raised from the dead. I don't know if you've given a whole lot of thought to this. You realize when you genuinely believe that death is not final, that it's no longer a threat, strength gets revealed through courage and hope. Like when you genuinely believe that death is not final and it can't destroy you even if it stings you, it kind of changes the way you live from there, doesn't it? I mean, we prayed a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, some of what all of us are seeing on the news these days in Afghanistan. It's only gotten worse since then, hasn't it? I read a story even just this week of a pastor in Afghanistan that got word from the Taliban. He said, we know who you are. We know where you meet. We know where you live. We know who your family is. We know what you're doing when you gather together on Sundays. And if you gather together tomorrow, it will be the last thing you do. To which the pastor calmly replied something to the effect of, I guess I'll see you tomorrow, right before I see Jesus. And it sounds like that's going to be the best day of my life so far. It's a person that realizes, shows, death's not final. That's not the end of my story. It's just a continuation of my hope. Lord willing, your courage is not going to be revealed to that degree. But middle schoolers, high schoolers, college students, the courage to stand out in a crowd, the courage to live differently, not to die on every hill. And sometimes courage is demonstrated by choosing to live in attention rather than die on a hill, right? But to live with honor and humility, consistency, and a focus on who Jesus is and what Jesus has done in the shadow of a cross and an empty tomb. Strength gets revealed through courage and hope when it finds itself pressed under pressure. The fourth one is this. Paul says, here's the report. The reputation of you, Thessalonians, everywhere. Your lives are transformed. You're patiently waiting. You're filled with hope and courage, trusting in a Jesus who rose from the dead. And lastly, verse 10, Jesus who rescues, literally is rescuing us from the coming wrath. I don't know if you think much about wrath, or if you've tried not to think about wrath at all. I mean, here's the deal. Maybe you're not even sure that you believe in a God at all. You certainly don't believe that you believe in a final judgment, or in a second coming, or a heaven, or a hell, or anything like that. And yet, isn't it true, all of us, every single one of us has a sense of coming wrath? All of us do. That somehow, someone or something, or maybe everything and everyone, that something's broken within us. Something about us doesn't measure up. Something's wrong or broken in us. All of us have this sense that we fall short of a standard that we didn't set and yet somehow believe is right and just. And one of these days, we're going to be found out and be the object of someone, or maybe everyone's, wrath, including our own. We have this sense that a day is coming that we need rescue from. And the promise of Jesus is that he has, and he can, and he will. That he lived the life that I should have lived, to die the death that I deserve to die, and that I can be accepted, so can you, forgiven, and set free. That Jesus is the only God who won't overpromise and underdeliver. The only one with the power and the perspective to judge justly in every circumstance. That he's the only one in all of human history to ever conquer death, raise to life, and never die again. That he promises life and God's favor on you as a child instead of God's wrath on you as his enemy. That's a worldview that's radically different from every single other try harder, do better religion that you'll find. And it's radically different from the humanist perspective that says this is as good as it gets. Try really hard to make it better. Spiritual strength finds its strength and reveals itself in our rescue. In our rescue. Question for you. Are you able and are you willing to show and tell your story of his rescue, of your life? We need those models. We need those messages. People in your world need those models and those messages. That's how they show up. They show up in our rescue. They show up in our patience. They show up in our transformation, in our courage, and our hope. That's where they show up, or how they show up. Where do they show up? Well, if you just look back through 1 Thessalonians, I think you find a couple of different things. It's not just people in general, it's people specifically that see and hear the message of Jesus, strength and hope and patience and transformation. Showed up in three primary places in 1 Thessalonians Chapter 1. I'm not saying that these are the only three, but I think they're primary and places for you and me as well. A strong spiritual core showed up and spoke up with people who were home, with people who were hurting, and with people in places who needed to hear. You see that all in 1 Thessalonians Chapter 1. The strength was demonstrated not just with words, but with power when they did what? They lived among each other for their sakes. Verse 5, people who are home. It showed up and spoke up near people who were hurting. Verse 6, you welcomed the message in the midst of severe suffering. And you became a model and took the message toward people in places who needed to hear. Verse 8, the message echoed. It rang out in Macedonia and Achaia and everywhere. It rang out around the world from them. I wonder where it will echo from you. And as I try to encourage you towards that, I also want to encourage you in that. Do you realize that is already the story that you're a part of in some way simply by being a part of Doxology Church? I mean, in fact, let me just tell you 3 super quick stories you may or may not be aware of. About 30 years ago, there was a group of college students that showed up at TCU from radically different backgrounds for radically different reasons. God did something in their heart while they were here. Some of them connected with Christ, and in a large part, he did it because of some of you who are a part of this church. Some of them connected with Christ. They started transforming together in community as college students. They developed a sense that there was more to life than just the life they were pursuing up to that point. They got a sense that they were sent people somewhere, and they didn't all know where. Some of them realized over time they were sent to stay, and some of them realized they were sent to go. And today, some of them have stayed, and they're still here 30 years later, leading businesses right here in Fort Worth that are a part of the flourishing of our city in real, tangible ways. One of them spent a couple of decades in Europe, discipling other college students. And now he's going to work strengthening marriages internationally, the part of a ministry called Family Life. One of them is working with police and military leaders in countries who have police and military rule. 2 of them are working to launch rapidly multiplying movements of people in a Muslim-dominated society. One of them is working and serving in Japan. One of them is working in refugee camps all across Europe. Something happened in this place, in a community of people, and it's still echoing 30 years later, literally around the world. I hope that encourages you. I hope it encourages you to know that's not just a 30-year echo. Last Sunday, there was a church planted in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was seeded in part by some of your financial investments and some people that we sent, including 2 full-time staff people. The messages are echoing all around the world. I hope that encourages you. And I hope it encourages you that this weekend we're going to send out somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple of thousand people into our pressurized, tension-filled world. People who are strengthening their core, connecting with Christ and showing where it connects, transforming together in community, and displaying strength that's different at a core level towards a world who's desperate to find life. Look, you don't have to be an expert to be a part of God's plan. The Thessalonians had only been following Jesus a couple of months, maybe as much as a year. You simply have to be a person who's connecting with Christ and know how it connects to your life. A person who's willing to transform, see transformation happening in your life and be willing to share the story. And a person who has eyes to engage your world, wherever you're sent, from your neighborhoods to the nations at the end of the earth. All of the spheres where you go, the stories, and the story of hope. Would you bow your head with me? If today you realize you've never connected with Christ, the best news that you can hear today is that he wants to connect with you. And in fact, he came to the world to die on a cross. He lived the life that you should have lived. And he died the death that you deserve to die. They put him in a grave, and he took your sin, all of the ways that you fell short of God's standard and deserved God's wrath. He put it in a tomb and buried it. And he came out in 3 days and left it in the tomb. And he's offering to forgive you and give you hope and to give you life, to give you strength, to give you his power from here throughout eternity. And he offers it simply as a gift. You can receive it right where you sit. It's as simple as just telling him, Jesus, I need you to rescue me from the coming wrath. And I've known that it was there, and I didn't know how to get out of it. And I've tried religion, I've tried trying, I've tried promising, I've tried resolving, and today I'm trusting in you to rescue me. Lord, for those who are trusting you for the very first time today, and those of us in this moment are remembering our connection with you years ago, Lord, would you allow us to be people who stand strong in a world like this, but not just who stand against a world like this, who stand strong in the middle and reveal strength that comes from the inside, that shows who Jesus is and what he's like, who tells the world of the hope that he brings and he offers, who live with resolve and purpose and strength that holds up in a tension-filled, pressurized world. We ask that we would be that in his name and for his sake. In Jesus' name, amen.